Chair, after all that anticipation, it's my pleasure to respond, I guess, straight after the contribution from the Minister, who I thought was slightly overzealous in his rebuttal of the opposition, who of course, acknowledged the need, acknowledged the need for us to be taking action on the issue of the synthetic drugs in particular. But our concern, and I think it's fair for us, Minister, to express that concern, is whether or not this is the most appropriate way to deal with this particular industry. And so we've got some questions that I hope in your next response you may address. And that is, I think some of the members have already raised, was the possibility of reversing the onus something that was feasible? And I'd be interested to hear via the Minister, via officials, whether or not waiting for products to enter the market and then gazetting them and taking them off was the most efficient and best way to minimise harm that we could have opted for. Is there any scope? Is there any international precedent for us reversing the onus before a product goes to market in this area? And I think it's a legitimate question. I think it's unfair that the Minister has labelled some of our questions as naive rather than addressing them directly. So I'd be interested in his response to that. Also, I'm interested in whether the Minister could share, based on his supplementary order paper, which I've just been reading through, and I think it is legitimate for the opposition to raise the issue of whether or not there could have been more time for analysis of such a hefty supplementary order paper, whether or not what kind of time frame it would take from the moment that a new product goes to market, for the time it may take for a minister by notice in the Gazette to specify a substance, preparation or mixture or article as a temporary class drug. What kind of time frame would that take? How long would a synthetic product be available on the market before we're able to have gone through that process? Have officials looked at the kind of harm that would be done, possibly done in the intervening period, and how much of that synthetic product could be purchased? And finally, I wondered if the Minister could talk us through some of the criteria which could be deemed to be subjective. I'm sure that there is probably some more in-depth analysis that's been done around the issue of whether or not a product poses a risk of harm to individuals or to society. What kind of criteria is used here? Is it broad enough in order to ensure that we're picking up all of the products that Parliament intends we pick up? And so, I would say to the Minister, this is a genuine concern for us. I walk through the area in which I live, and there are a small handful of retailers who do sell chronic, and I make a point of every time I see it going in and asking them why, and whether or not they perceive that it's beneficial to the community which they operate in, which they live in, and which they do their business, for them to be peddling such a product. And I have to acknowledge I get a very coy response every time. One shop owner promised me, ma'am, that he would take the product off by next week before I said I would come in and do my own spot check again. But, this is the extent to which we're going as individuals who have concern about these products in lieu of us being able to react quickly. So I acknowledge the Minister is trying to do that. I only question whether there is another way that we could have responded. The Minister also mentioned the fact that New Zealand is held in high regard internationally for the way in which we deal with these issues. I would still say, though, that in comparison more broadly to the drug debate, there are very few countries who are currently in step with what the UN Global Commission on Drugs has recommended. I'd have to say that was a paper which really broached some subjects which the Law Commission has as well, which to date many countries have stood back from and been very reluctant to adopt a full harm minimisation approach. And I would really be interested to hear the Minister's view on some of that international discussion that's gone on at a UN level, because from my perspective New Zealand's quite out of step with what that Commission has recommended. And my first contribution to this House on this bill, I talked a little bit about how many years ago I sat in on a presentation given by a Hawaiian expert on the issue of methamphetamine and the drug that has become a scourge in New Zealand. And I do want to, Mr Chair. Thank you, Mr Chair. And it was clear at that point that this was a very different drug we were dealing with, primarily because of the ability for it to be manufactured domestically. So often in New Zealand we perhaps have been saved by our borders, but not in the case of methamphetamine, and we are suffering as a consequence. So of course the public looks to the Parliament to respond to that scourge, and our question has to be, have we done all that we could do? Now, one thing that the Labour opposition has been asking for is some of the evidence around the various measures around tools in particular, but also evidence that requesting that you have to get a prescription in order to be able to get drugs with pseudoephedrine from a pharmacist, whether or not that's going to have the full impact on this industry that Parliament would intend. And it seems clear from the Select Committee report, which I read with some interest, that the Ministry of Health in particular wasn't even able to quantify the knock-on effect of this policy. We weren't able to financially estimate what kind of cost it would have on consumers. Now, I acknowledge, of course, we want to do all we can around methamphetamine, but we must also take it upon ourselves to take an evidence-based approach. Surely that is the expectation of the public as well, that not only we do as much as we can, but that we base it all on evidence. And I'm still yet to be convinced. I'm yet to be convinced from what I've seen come out of the Select Committee that enough work was done on this particular area. Because let's not underestimate the impact that it will have on consumers. Now, I appreciate the remarks that were made by Dr. Paul Hutchison on the alternatives that exist. And of course, I unfortunately am able only to rely on my own anecdotal evidence of having found some of the replacements for pseudoephedrines to be mere placebos in my mind. I don't think there's anything that quite does the job of a pseudoephedrine. And my concern is that when we at the same time are trying to take a preventative approach, trying to take ensure that as many people as possible don't have to go through the cost of visiting a GP for something that is usually easily manageable, we haven't actually weighed up the burden of cost in that regard, and I think that is most unfortunate. And when we are looking at the issue of evidence, but also coupling that with the idea, the notion, the new modern notion of when it comes to drug law, harm minimisation, I would have been incredibly interested to see that Parliament probably would say that when in terms of harm to society, methamphetamine of course is high, alcohol in terms of the level of cost on society is high, but if we looked at whether or not, in terms of the relative spend in society on police time, on police resources, how much is spent on methamphetamine versus, say, cannabis, and how many people are imprisoned in our country for minor cannabis offences versus methamphetamine offences, and what relative resource are we spending on the drugs that do the most harm to our communities relative to others. Now, I just throw that up as something that I think that we should be having more of a debate over, because although Parliament spends probably a relatively larger amount of time on the issues that do have the greatest harm, alcohol, methamphetamine, is that reflected in the way that we're operating on a day-to-day basis via our law enforcement and via our imprisonment regime? And I think it's a legitimate question to ask, and that ultimately is why the UN Global Commission on Drug Policy has started questioning whether or not our emphasis is in the right areas. And I think if we are going to look at international evidence, I think those are the trends that we should start. And if we are going to be world leading, that's the kind of response we need to be giving. And it is bold. And the community will need reassurance that we are still doing all of this in the best interest of our communities. But at the moment, we have to acknowledge we're failing, and we are failing abysmally. That's not to say, though, that we cannot continue to use the tools that we have and do as much as we can. But again, it does need to be evidence-based. And on this particular area, on these two tools as contained in Part 1, the issue of tools and utensils, and requiring prescription in order to purchase pseudoephedrine, I'm not convinced these are the big hitters that we need in order to crack the methamphetamine issue in New Zealand, which ultimately must be the aim of this Parliament.
Joe, could you?
Now put.
I'll hear the